All right, you want to get a little more academic, and I think we found just the paper for that, easing optimization paths, a circuit perspective.
Yeah, this is a really cool look at how we can make neural networks learn way more efficiently.
I am intrigued by this idea of thinking about neural networks in terms of circuits.
It's a really interesting framework.
Can we break down exactly what circuits are in this context? Like, what are we actually talking about?
So think of a neural network of a giant web of information pathways, right?
Okay, got it. A big complex web.
Yeah, and a circuit is basically a specific route within that web that's responsible for taking like some input and transforming it into a particular output that we want.
So instead of trying to wrap our heads around the entire network all at once, we can sort of zoom in on these smaller, more manageable units, these circuits.
Exactly. And the paper actually uses this really neat visual analogy to help illustrate it.
Okay, I'm all about visuals.
They use something called a bipartite graph.
Okay,
You can kind of think of it like a map with all these interconnected dots, and each dot represents a specific part of the network.
gotcha. So we can actually visualize how these circuits are connected and how they like evolve as the network learns.
Exactly. And that's where gradient descent comes in.
Ah, yes, the workhorse of AI training.
Exactly. It's the main method we use to train these networks. And what the paper argues is that gradient descent is essentially acting like a sculptor.
Oh, okay, a sculptor. Interesting analogy.
Yeah, it's like chiseling away at the network, shaping and refining these circuits.
So walk me through that. How does gradient descent actually do that shaping?
So with each iteration of the training process, gradient descent is analyzing which pathways are actually leading to the correct output, the results we want.
Right, it's getting feedback.
Exactly. And then it strengthens the connections within those successful circuits, making them more efficient at doing their job.
Okay, so it's reinforcing the good stuff.
And at the same time, it's gradually pruning away the pathways that are leading to errors, the ones that aren't working so well.
So it's like the network is learning through trial and error, constantly fine-tuning itself based on the feedback it's getting.
Exactly. And as it goes through this process, something really fascinating starts to emerge.
What's that?
The researchers found that networks often develop what they call subcircuits.
Subcircuits. So we're going even smaller, even more specialized than the circuits themselves.
Exactly. Think of them like little specialized modules that handle specific subtasks within the larger problem the network is trying to solve.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture.
And they illustrate this really well with an example they call the modular addition problem.
Modular addition. Okay, sounds mathy.
Yeah, it is. Basically, they trained a network to add numbers. And what they found is that the network didn't just learn to add directly.
Oh, interesting. What did it do?
It actually first developed a subcircuit specifically for counting the number of zeros in a sequence.
So it's like it figured out this necessary stepping stone, this like prerequisite skill before tackling the main challenge of addition.
Exactly. It's pretty remarkable.
It is remarkable. And you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of this concept I've heard about called curriculum learning.
You're exactly right. That's actually a key point the paper highlights.
So is the idea that instead of just throwing a really complex problem at the network, we might be able to help it learn more effectively by breaking it down into smaller steps?
Precisely, just like with humans.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect someone to learn calculus before they understand algebra, right?
Exactly. And to test this theory out, they designed a really interesting experiment.
Okay, tell me about it.
So they trained one group of networks directly on a challenging version of this modular addition problem using numbers from a larger set.
Okay, so just straight into the deep end.
Right. And then another group they first trained on that simpler version of the problem. Remember the one where they learned to count zeros?
Right, so that was like their pre-training, almost like a foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And then they introduced them to the harder task.
So we've got two different learning paths here, one with a more structured curriculum and one without what happened. What were the results?
The results were actually pretty striking.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me.
So the networks that were trained directly on that harder problem, they often failed to generalize.
What does that mean?
It means they could kind of memorize the training data, but when they were presented with new examples that they hadn't seen before, they struggled.
Ah, so they were like students who just crammed for a test but didn't really understand the underlying
A
concept.
perfect analogy. But the networks that first learned that simpler task, the ones that developed that crucial subcircuit for counting zeros,
Yeah.
they excelled on that harder version. They were able to actually generalize their knowledge and apply it to new situations.
Wow, so that initial scaffolding that they got from that simpler task made a world of difference.
Exactly. It allowed them to build this more robust understanding.
And this is where I think the real implications of this whole circuit perspective start to become clear.
Right.
If we can understand how these circuits develop, how they interact, and how we can nurture them through strategic training, then we could potentially make AI systems way more efficient and more robust.
Absolutely. This research is still in its early stages, but the potential is enormous.
It's exciting stuff. Imagine being able to design AI systems that learn more, like humans gradually building up their knowledge base and adapting to new challenges with greater ease.
Exactly. And while this particular paper focused on a relatively simple mathematical task,
Yeah.
it opens up all these fascinating questions about how these circuits might function in more complex domains like language processing or image recognition.
That's exactly what I was thinking. If a network develops subcircuits for counting zeros before learning to add, what kind of fundamental building blocks might emerge when it's trying to, understand language or generate art?
That's a question researchers are actively exploring right now, and the insights could be absolutely transformative.
It's like we're trying to map out the cognitive architecture of AI.
Exactly. And by understanding those underlying structures, we could potentially design AI systems that are not only more capable, but also more transparent and more reliable.
It's incredible to think that by studying these circuits, we could gain a deeper understanding of how AI might develop something akin to human-like reasoning or even creativity.
It's definitely a tantalizing prospect, and this research has the potential to not only revolutionize how we design AI,
Mhm.
but also how we understand our own intelligence.
So this isn't just about building better machines, it's about gaining a deeper understanding of intelligence itself.
Absolutely. By studying the emergence of these circuits, we're essentially exploring the fundamental principles of learning and adaptation.
That's a pretty profound thought. It's like we're using AI as a mirror to reflect back on our own cognitive processes.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And the more we learn about how AI learns, the
Right.
more we might discover about the nature of intelligence itself, whether it's biological or artificial. Yeah, it is. It's pretty remarkable.
And it kind of reminds me of this concept I've heard of called curriculum learning.
You're right on the money. That's a key point that the paper highlights.
So is the idea basically that instead of just throwing a super complex problem at a network right away, we could maybe help it learn more effectively by breaking it down into like smaller steps?
Exactly. Starting with simpler tasks allows the network to develop these foundational subcircuits, kind of like building blocks.
Yeah, it makes sense. You wouldn't expect someone to learn calculus before they understand algebra.
Precisely. And to test this theory out, they designed a really interesting experiment.
Oh, I like experiments. What do they do?
They trained one group of networks directly on a challenging version of this modular addition problem using numbers from a larger set.
Okay, so like straight into the deep end.
Right. And then another group they first trained on that simpler version of the problem, the one where they learned to count the zeros.
Right, so that was like their pre-training, almost like laying the foundation.
Exactly. And then after that, they introduced them to the harder task.
So we've got two different learning paths here, one with a more structured curriculum and one without. What happened? Spill the results.
The results were really striking, actually.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me.
The networks that were trained directly on the harder problem, they often failed to generalize.
Failed to generalize. What does that mean exactly?
It means they could kind of memorize the training data, but when they were presented with new examples they hadn't seen before, they struggled.
So they were like students who just crammed for the test but didn't really understand the concepts.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. But the networks that first learned that simpler task, remember the ones that developed that subcircuit for counting zeros?
Yeah.
Those networks, they excelled on the harder version. They were actually able to generalize their knowledge and apply it to new situations.
So that initial scaffolding they got from learning the simpler task first made a huge difference.
Exactly. I allowed them to build this more robust understanding.
And this is where I think the really big implications of this whole circuit perspective become clear, right?
Absolutely.
If we can understand how these circuits develop, how they interact, and how we can sort of nurture them through more strategic training, then we could potentially make AI systems so much more efficient and more robust.
Exactly. This research is still pretty early, but the potential is huge.
It's really exciting stuff. Imagine being able to design AI systems that learn more like humans, gradually building up their knowledge and adapting to new challenges more easily.
Exactly. And while this paper focuses on a relatively simple task, adding numbers,
Right.
it opens up all these fascinating questions about how these circuits might work in more complex domains like language processing or image recognition.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like if a network is developing subcircuits for counting zeros before it learns to add, what kind of fundamental building blocks might emerge when it's trying to understand language or, create art.
That's a question researchers are digging into right now, and the insights could be totally transformative.
It's almost like we're trying to map out the cognitive architecture of AI.
Exactly. And if we can understand those underlying structures, we could potentially design AI systems that are not only more capable, but also more transparent and reliable.
Yeah, more trustworthy.
Exactly.
Yeah, more trustworthy. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And it's really incredible to think that By studying these circuits, we might actually get a deeper understanding of how AI could develop something kind of like human reasoning, or even creativity.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought. And this research, it's not just about making better AI, is it?
No, not at all.
It's like we're also gaining a deeper understanding of intelligence itself.
Absolutely. By studying these circuits, we're basically exploring, the fundamental principles of learning and adaptation.
That's a really profound thought. It's almost like we're using AI as a mirror, right?
Yeah.
To reflect back on how our own minds work.
I love that analogy. And I think the more we learn about how AI learns, the more we might discover about intelligence itself, whether it's biological or artificial.
This whole deep dive has been really mind-blowing.
It has.
We started with this simple idea of circuits in a neural network, and now we're talking about the very nature of intelligence.
It's amazing what you can find when you really dig into these research papers, right?
It's always so much more beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Well, this paper has definitely given us a whole new way to think about how AI learns and, what that means for the future. It's exciting stuff.
It really is.
I know I'm going to be thinking about these circuits for a long time.
Me too. And I think we've only just scratched the surface of this whole area of research.
Yeah, who knows what other discoveries are out there waiting for us as we keep exploring the inner workings of AI.
That's what makes this whole field so exciting.
There's always more to learn, more to discover. Well, hey, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure, and we'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.